This incident occurred during my second year of college, sometime in the fall of 2002. All 4 years there, I worked as a waitress in a small family restaurant next to campus. The pay was far from adequate, but the owners treated me like one of them. Growing up without parents made this connection very important to me, so much so they remain an important part of my life to this day. I was one of 4 girls working nights, and 3 of us were students currently attending the university. The surrounding neighborhood had been on a downward slide for the past 20 years. Even with a large number of students inhabiting the area, crime was still steadily on the rise. In order to at least try to prevent ourselves from becoming victims of said crime, several safety measures were implemented. All the usual things, escorting each other to our cars, not leaving the back door open, things like that. However, no matter how hard you try to be safe, some a-hole will find a way to violate you anyway. One late night, just as we were wrapping up the dinner shift, a giant idiot would do just this and, in the process, almost cause a beautiful family to collapse. That night, we were quickly coming on the end of another regular dinner shift when a man came in and said he wanted to get something to go. No problem. I took his order and gave it to the kitchen. Working the kitchen that night was Matt, the owner's only son, and he wasn't happy when he saw it. He tried to throw it together as fast as possible so he could finish cleaning and head home. While he waited, the man paced nervously, looking outside repeatedly. This behavior seemed kind of shady, so I stopped my closing duties and began looking outside to see if I could see what he was looking at. It took a minute, but I caught sight of another man standing just out of view of the bay windows. This guy was dirty-looking. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed or combed in years. The second man's actions were very similar to the others, almost as if though they were about to rob us. I foolishly pushed my instincts aside and began ringing up the man's orders. When I gave him the total, he quickly handed me a $20 bill and looked behind him. I continued to ignore his behavior, and when I opened the drawer, I heard a man's voice quietly tell me to give him all the money in the register. Maybe from instinct, I looked up to see who it was. It was all coming from the customer, and he was holding a handgun at my face. "Keep your voice down and don't panic. Just give me the money and I'll leave." This entire time I had been the only employee in the front of the house, so he had me at his mercy. Every word he said quivered as it came from his mouth. His fear made mine even worse. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed every cent out of the drawer and was about to hand it to him when I heard Matt's voice coming from behind me. "Did you forget something?" Everything that happened after this went by so fast. I still question my recollection of events to this day. I know for sure that Matt's arrival surprised us both, but the look on the customer or robber's face was pure shock. The second I noticed him moving the gun away from my face, I crouched behind the podium to hide. The gunfire followed soon after that. I wasn't sure if Matt had been shot at this point. I was still curled up on the floor with my arms over my head, very similar to a child hiding under the covers in hopes the boogeyman will go away. I don't know how long I stayed like that. A few seconds, maybe. When I did peek out from my arms, all I saw was Matt's body laying motionless on the floor. Even then, I stayed where I was until I heard the voice of his mom yelling out to us. That's when I finally stood up to see the results. The shooter was gone, and money was scattered all over the floor from where I dropped it. Matt more than likely died immediately. At his feet, grilled chicken salad was scattered everywhere like the money. Matt's mom stormed out of the back. When she saw her only son lying on the floor, she collapsed in grief next to him, and this is where she stayed until the police arrived. Just to avoid making an already long story longer, I'll leave you with the facts. Even after telling the cops everything I saw and giving a detailed description of both men, neither man was caught. The family closed the restaurant for several days after the shooting and stayed that way until a few days after the funeral. From the day of the reopening, a cop in plain clothes has protected the place, and there hasn't ever been another holdup since. My work at the restaurant would continue for the remainder of my time at the university. I was shaken up for quite a while, and may have been for far longer if it wasn't for the love and support of the family. We seemed to have served as a coping mechanism for one another, and through the shared pain of Matt's death, brought closer together. After I graduated, I moved on and am currently living in Atlanta with my partner. The restaurant continues running 5 days a week and doing well. It seems the neighborhood may be on its way up. In the last year, several large companies have opened branches, and the continued growth has proved to be a positive thing for all concerned. Allison, the matriarch of the family, recently told me on a phone call that she was willing to put up with the hipsters that were slowly invading the area. After all, they were a big step up from the murdering crackheads that had been seen there before. If I have my dates right, this happened on November 17th of 2017. It was a Friday night, and my roommates and I were going to dinner before we headed to my brother's club. No one could agree on what they wanted to eat, so we ended up driving around for an hour. All the indecision was driving me mad, so I finally made the choice for everyone. This particular restaurant served the best egg rolls in town. It also used to be where I waited tables. However, after the owners sold it to an investment group, it became an intolerable work environment, and I was forced to seek employment at another restaurant. Keeping the chef was their only wise decision. I wish I could recommend it to you, but after what had happened, you'll see why you may want to give it a pass. A line was already beginning to form out in the front of the building, but I was willing to wait. My roommates moaned, but I assured them that the food would be worth it. They should have counted themselves lucky. I'd waited tables on Friday where the line stretched 3 blocks. I was pleased to see we were only 20 customers from the door, and the line was moving rather quickly for a Friday night. As we stood around waiting, we began making small talk to pass the time. Just a few moments later, a group of people at the door began yelling at each other. They were involved in an argument with another gentleman that had just left the restaurant a moment prior. I can't tell you what they were arguing about. It all took place in an Asian language, possibly Vietnamese. I'm still not sure. The language they were using didn't matter much. They were obviously all angry about something. While this big melee was roaring right in front of the restaurant, the line wasn't moving. An older gentleman, a few places in front of us, finally had enough and approached the arguing group and asked them to take their disagreement somewhere else. He was nothing but kind and didn't raise his voice at any point in the conversation. His intervention only served to worsen the problem. Now both parties involved in the argument turned on the older man and began yelling at him in broken English, mostly curse words. The back end of the line, including us, began moving in closer, attempting to get a better hold on what was going on. The noisy back and forth continued for several minutes until it became violent. The lone Asian gentleman who had been accosted by the group started cursing in an unknown language once again. Suddenly, in a very casual manner, he pulled out a large pocket knife from his jacket, opened it, and began stabbing the older man over and over. He did this probably 5 to 7 times in quick succession and returned it to his jacket pocket after folding it closed. Before he turned and walked away, he threw up his hands and yelled one more thing in an unknown language. I was in a state of shock and couldn't believe what I had just seen. The man didn't even seem to care that he'd done what he had in front of multiple witnesses. He didn't run away or nothing, just walked away calmly and casually. The older gentleman was beginning to fall over, so one of the women in line, who later turned out to be a nurse, told him to lay down while she applied pressure on his wounds. I don't think he'd even realized himself what had occurred to him. The look of surprise on his face was very upsetting. Almost every member of the line had their phones out and dialing 911 in seconds. I take my hat off to the New York Emergency Services. They were on the scene in less than 5 minutes. It seemed that the gentleman wouldn't survive despite their fast response. The pool of blood surrounding him was already large and was getting larger by the second. When they rushed him away, he was still conscious but starting to fade. The nurse left with them, still holding her hands firmly against his chest. Strangely, most of the crowd had already disappeared, and the few of us left could only tell the police what we'd witnessed. At some point, while everyone was distracted, The group of 3 people the assailant had been arguing with quietly and silently slipped away. I can only assume they thought they'd possibly be held accountable in some way for the attack, since they were the only people who knew what the argument was about or what was said between them. No one else could provide the police with any answers. That older man just happened to barge into something he shouldn't have. After seeing a man attempt to end the life of another man, I didn't have much of an appetite or desire to dance. 2 of my roommates still felt like eating, so I left them there to get an Uber home while myself and Nita, my 4th roomie, returned to our apartment. We shared a small bowl of leftover spaghetti and crashed for the night. I scoured the internet for days after in hopes of hearing the older gentleman's fate, but I never did discover whether he lived or died. Same thing goes for his attacker. The residents of that part of town are known for being tight-lipped toward the police. I hate to think he's been allowed to get away with that. Could very possibly be murder. If I do hear any news in the future, I'll share it with you and your readers. You can possibly guess that after this, I never returned to that restaurant. No egg rolls, no matter how good they may be, are worth my life. I'm not proud of how I behaved in this story, or to admit I was utterly clueless, but it happened. At 17, I took a job waiting tables at a new highbrow restaurant that had opened the year before. Any eating place that ranked above Golden Corral had a very hard time making a go of it where I lived. When I returned home from my first shift and told my folks some of the food we offered, I was met with 2 blank stares. My dad didn't even know what filet mignon was before I told him, and I'm still not sure he completely grasped the concept. My mom has already been the more worldly of the 2, and even she wasn't sure what the restaurant was trying to offer. Their attitudes proved to be shared by the majority of others around town when I told them where I was working, and this mindset left me with a very little faith that I'd have my job for long. Fortunately, the chef that opened the place had made a great name for himself in Dallas, and his fans were more than happy to make the 45-minute drive to eat at his new restaurant. Being exposed to something new like this made the job more enjoyable than working the counter at McDonald's. The customers were also much classier and kinder than many of the people I had grown up with. Probably the most loved of the regulars was a businessman from Plano named Preston. He treated the waitstaff with respect and tipped more than he ever needed. One Thursday evening, he came into the restaurant with his wife and another couple. After choosing their wine, they ordered their dishes. Roughly 15 minutes passed, and I was called to bring their orders to the table. All was well, so I moved on. Less than a minute went by before I heard a lady's cry coming from behind me. I turned around to see Mr. Preston standing at his table, flailing his arms about. His panic had me perplexed until the wife of the other couple yelled, "He's choking! Help him, please!" Like I said at the start, I'm not proud to say it, but I had zero idea of what to do. You could clearly see he was scared and beginning to turn blue. I was panicking now. Just in the nick of time, Mrs. Preston returned from the restroom to calmly wrap her arms around her husband and thrust them against his diaphragm. A hunk of steak shot out of his mouth like a bullet, and he instantly returned to his normal color. She nonchalantly kissed him on his cheek and said, "Honey, you need to start chewing your meat more. One day, no one will be around to help you." A cute, sly grin appeared on her face as she sat down. Mr. Preston also sat and continued breathing heavily for a couple of minutes. Her calm yet decisive action in such a scary time threw me for a loop. That lady will always have my respect. I was still freaked out, so I had to go sit in the back for a minute to regain my composure. When the owner saw me and asked me what was wrong, I explained to him how harrowing those few moments were. After I described what Mrs. Preston had done, he explained it was something called the Heimlich maneuver and what it did. The incident did become a motivating factor in his decision to make the restaurant's employees take CPR classes just in case something similar happened in the future. So I guess a customer's near death did cause something positive to happen. Once I pulled myself together, I headed back out to check on my tables, starting with the Prestons. Mrs. Preston went on to explain that this had happened before, a few times, and she had made her husband promise he wouldn't eat steak when he was alone. Nearly choking to death still hadn't taught him to chew his food well, but I still can't eat steak, even 10 years after witnessing it. My first job waiting tables in college also just happened to be my first time meeting a person with mental illness. The place I was working at had this schizophrenic dishwasher named Irving. He was actually a very kind man, but I could see why his physical size may have intimidated anyone who didn't know him. I'd wager he was about 6'5", and his frame was what I would call husky, but he was by no means fat. His childlike manner meant you were virtually unable to dislike him, and many of his innocent takes on life make me laugh still. I happened to have a friend whose mother served as his caseworker for about a year. She told him that although he basically had the mind of a young child, on the rare occasions he became violent, he could do a lot of damage. Even after hearing this from a person who saw Irving on a clinical basis, I couldn't dream I would ever be in a situation to see him lash out. Our work environment was very lighthearted, and I can rarely remember an instance in which another employee, the owner included, ever raised their voices. Employee turnover was very low because of this. I'm sorry to say, however, the day I'd never expected to see happened before we opened on a Wednesday evening. The routine we dinner shift employees would follow was that we would usually arrive at 4 p.m. and never see the guys that came in the morning for prep. They usually came in around 8 and were done with their work way before the dinner shift arrived. The 1% of times we did run into them, it rarely went well. 2 of the 3 guys were cool, but one in particular, Cliff, was a real jerk. This evening, Cliff aimed his venom at Irving. I'm not sure if he had a death wish or he was just stupid. Probably stupid, actually. But it seemed he mistook Irving's kindness for weakness and began talking to him in a very condescending manner. "Hey, Corky, can you wash this pot for us? I want to get home before midnight, so hurry." Despite not yet being on the clock yet, he was more than happy to do it. I think the regular dishwasher had already left, and Cliff thought he was too good to wash it himself. The other prep cook, Johnny, also happened to be the sous chef, and he was quick to tell Cliff not to be rude to Irving. Perhaps not solely for Irving's sake, but Cliff's reply showed the utter contempt he held for Irving. "That dummy isn't smart enough to know what I'm doing. I'll be fine." No more than a second after finishing his thought, Irving made a fast turn and swatted Cliff with one hand, knocking him a few feet into the big double oven. The oven put off a lot of heat and must have burned Cliff badly. His screaming made my blood curdle. I just happened to be in the kitchen when this occurred, and it was my first and last time to witness Irving's anger. Cliff barely had time to acknowledge what was going on, and Irving didn't appear to be done. I don't know if anyone else was as terrified for Cliff as I was. I didn't dare make a move, not because I was scared of Irving. I was more afraid that Cliff would go after him. Instead, Cliff knew he'd messed up and didn't have enough time to get away. Thinking quickly on his feet, Johnny spoke up in time to distract Irving from smashing Cliff again. "Hey, big man, have you got that big stew pot for me? I've got to make a batch of gumbo for tonight, and we open in half an hour." As if someone switched on a light, Irving's scowl became a big, happy smile in an instant. "Okay, Johnny, here you go." He pulled the pot from the hot dishwasher and handed it to him like the last few seconds had never happened, and went back to his work. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever witnessed. I was sure Cliff was about to die right in front of me, but one kind word managed to defuse it. I don't know if Johnny really did have to make gumbo, but he knew Irving very well and how much he liked him. I'm just glad he was there to prevent Irving from ruining his life over some idiot we all hated. Johnny then nonchalantly took Cliff into the office and closed the door. I'm unaware of what was said, but after that discussion, Cliff never spoke unless spoken to again. Johnny did tell a group of us later that Irving wasn't going to be punished. He had a talk with the owner that night, and They agreed that Cliff was the party at fault. After his burns were treated, he was sent home, and I never saw him again. I did, however, see Irving many more times, and he always had a big grin on his face. Seeing firsthand how quickly he could switch back and forth gave me a small insight into the mind of a mentally ill individual and made me much more sympathetic to their plight. This is one of the main reasons I decided to go on and become a mental health professional. I felt a duty to become an advocate for the mentally ill and make sure they would not be labeled as raving mad people like the way most of the public see them. The way, I'm ashamed to say, even I once believed them to be. I'd gone the first 22 years of life without having any near-death experiences and hoped to make it through the rest the same way. Unfortunately, a month ago, I was put in such a terrifying position, I was afraid my life was about to end. The gist of the story is that I was the victim of mistaken identity. From what I've been able to gather in the interim, a former female employee was having a tryst with a fellow male employee, and her boyfriend or ex-boyfriend, I'm still not sure, did not approve of the relationship. I want to start by saying that I never worked with or even knew the woman in question. Being a gay man, she wouldn't have been my type if I had. A couple of people that were around when she was told me that she and the man she was sleeping with had been fired a good 6 months prior to my employment. The unlucky coincidence appears to be that he and I shared the same first name and physical description. This had to have been why I was confused with him. A quiet evening in July, I was working, waiting tables, and just before 7:30, I got a single male sat in my section. He didn't look especially mean upon first sight, but he was a rather large man. I'm 5'11", and this man towered over me. Nothing was said at first. I took his drink order, and when I returned with it, he confronted me about the affair. "So you're the loser that's banging my girl?" I asked him to repeat what he'd said, and only got more hostility in return. "You heard me, boy. Ginger told me about your affair last night." His demeanor terrified me. I knew if he wanted, he could easily destroy me. Fighting had never been my forte, and a guy his size would have no trouble laying me out. I did my best to assure him I didn't know his girlfriend, but this only made him angrier. "Listen, you can deny it all you want, but she told me your name and what you look like. Saying you don't know her is just making me more mad." I could see the hate burning in his eyes. He spoke with gritted teeth, and spittle was beginning to come out of the corners of his mouth. My shaking had to have been obvious to him. I was on the verge of running away, but I didn't want to come off as any bigger a coward than I already was. "I'm sorry, sir. I in no way want to make you angry, but I swear that I've never met a girl named Ginger in my entire life. If she worked here, it must have been before I started. I literally only worked here for a few months. Any relationship I had ever had hasn't even included a female, if you get my meaning." It took a moment, but he caught on, and his scowl morphed into a smug grin in seconds. Telling a complete stranger about my preferences wasn't a discussion I wanted to have. However, I was out of ideas and decided on the Hail Mary. "You look like one of those deviants, but it's going to take a lot more to convince me than that." Playing that card must have been a bad idea. Although his voice had lowered slightly, he was balling his hands into fists, and this made my trembling worse. "Why don't you man up and admit you were balling my girl? You got a whooping coming either way. If you admit it, I might be a bit easier on you." It was as if he hadn't heard anything I'd said since he first accused me. The whole time this had been going on, I hadn't been aware of what else was going on around me. Someone in the restaurant, perhaps a patron, had notified my manager what was happening at this table. He came around just as the man had threatened to assault me and interrupted the conversation. "Excuse me, sir. I just overheard your threat toward my employee, and that is something I cannot allow customers to do. I'd like you to leave immediately, or I'll be forced to call the police." "You can call whoever you want. I don't care. I'm just here to tell this little wimp I'm going to give him a stomping for banging my Ginger." The manager's threat didn't seem to make any difference to the man. He was still just as mad before and wasn't showing any signs of leaving. "Sir, if you mean Ginger, the girl who left here more than 6 months ago, I can almost guarantee you that this young man never had any interactions with her. Now, there was another young man with the same name as him that I was forced to fire the same time as Ginger. I inform every employee at the time they are hired that relationships between employees are forbidden, especially when one of those employees are management. A rumor that they were violating this policy reached me, and when asked about it, they both confirmed it. Because of this, they were both terminated that same day. This young man is a new employee and to my knowledge does not know either of these two. Maybe you should go back to Ginger and ask her to be more specific about the situation. Like I said, I can't have people coming into my restaurant and threatening my employees. You heard the real story, so now you can leave. And please do so now." The entire time my manager spoke, he never raised his voice except for the end. Even then, he kept his composure. I think because of this, the man finally started to believe what I had told him. He stood up at the table, and he must have been at least 6'5". One more shudder of fear shot through me when I realized how massive he was. "Okay, mister. I'm gonna go and have a talking to Ginger again. And if I find out you lied to me, I'm coming back and putting both of you down." The man then turned for the exit. "I'd recommend you not do that, sir." My manager hit him with one more parting shot as he left, but the giant ignored it. Once he was gone, I could finally breathe again. After I took a few minutes to calm myself, I returned to work. That evening, and every shift I've worked since, our manager has made sure to walk with me to my car when I get off. He's had a permit to carry a handgun for some time, so this safety measure does make me feel secure. I don't think he's really worried about himself. Since we have our own parking area in the back of the building, not many other people come back there. I'm not even sure many other people know about it. I, nor anyone else, have seen the man since that night, but will probably continue with the escorts for the foreseeable future. I pray each day I leave for work that I won't see that monster ever again. If he does return, I'll update my post. However, I'm pretty sure if he was going to, he would have by now. Let's hope I'm right. What I'm sharing may not be as serious as many of the other stories I've seen, but one recent incident in particular has led me to think I should reach out to someone for advice. I'm a 24-year-old female that has just lost my job as a personal assistant to a mid-level executive in the fashion industry. My termination came so quickly I was unable to find another job in the same line of work before my rent came due. Desperation drove me to apply for a waitress job at a small family restaurant near my apartment. Despite having no prior history waiting tables, I got the job. I guess the owners were as desperate as I was at that moment. My first shift was on a Monday afternoon, and I soon came to realize I enjoyed the work. Most of the customers were regulars. They were very kind and understanding of my hiccups and tipped well. It didn't take long for me to catch on, and I was allowed to take as many shifts as I wanted. Before I knew it, I'd got my bills paid for the month and even had a little left over for a celebratory bottle of wine. As I write this, I've worked at the restaurant for 3 months and almost every minute on the clock has been a blast. Crazy, right? Yeah, I know it's not a sentence I'd ever expected to say when I agreed to take the job. At first, my intention was to stay only long enough to get another fashion-related job, but finding out I was good at the table waiting thing has greatly increased my self-esteem. Not to mention, the money is good. I can't say I had any complaints about the job until a few weeks ago. On a late Sunday evening, one of the regulars appeared to have formed a crush on me. I wasn't aware of it at the time, or even aware of him until I waited on him the following lunch shift. He had been on an extended vacation, and now that I've met him, I wish he would have stayed where he was. The customer in question is a 64-year-old gentleman who recently retired from the drilling industry. Not exactly my type, I must say, and a bit too old for me. My introduction to him wasn't any more strange than any of the other regulars. However, the way in which he stared at me the entire time made me nervous. Then he left me $100 tip on a $6.50 tab. My initial reaction was one of joy, but as I dwelled upon it, I became uncomfortable with taking it. His return on that Thursday afternoon escalated my discomfort to an entire new level. I attempted to wait on him, as he was just another customer, but his reasons behind the massive tip soon became obvious. When I took his drink order, he asked me if I appreciated my large tip. This gave me the opportunity to tell him I wasn't comfortable taking a tip that large, but he interrupted me before I had the chance and hinted that I was now beholden to go on a date with him. The idea disarmed me. I wasn't sure that he meant what I thought, but just to be safe, I returned the $100 bill to him. The last thing I wanted to be seen as was some form of prostitute. When he was young, some women who waited tables may have sold themselves, but this girl is no whore. When I handed the bill back to him, a look of shock appeared on his face, soon followed by a big smile. All he could say was, "I've never seen a woman turn down a $100 bill. Now I see how it's going to be." This reaction confused me. It was exactly the opposite of what I'd hoped for. I expected him to get mad, or at least get that I wasn't for sale. Him thinking I was playing hard to get scared me a little. However, I did consider that maybe I was perhaps misunderstanding what he meant. Our age gap could be making me misconstrue his intentions. It was possible he was only trying to show his appreciation for my services. For the remainder of his time in the restaurant that day, I said very little to him, and he met me with his usual fawning gaze. Once he left, a load of relief was lifted from my shoulders. It was short-lived, however, when I returned to the table and saw the $100 bill sitting there. This was beginning to look like some type of game he was playing with me. I had the impression that once I accepted that tip, I would be accepting of much more in his mind. This brings us up to a few days ago, when he was once again seated in my section. Before I could do anything, I had to make it clear that I could not accept that $100 tip. Once again, I handed it back to him and told him that I was in a long-term relationship and could not go out with him, even once. My speech didn't appear to make a dent in his facade. He replied by saying that he had no idea what I was talking about, but as he said it, a sly, childish grin was pasted on his face. I was starting to become angry at the way he was acting and stormed off to get his drink. By the time I made it back, something had very much changed in his demeanor. The usual doting and loving eyes had disappeared and been replaced by a simmering fury I would have never expected to come from him. His grin was no longer there. His face had become expressionless and cold. When I noticed this change, a jolt of fear shot through me. From that point, nothing else was said between us. One thing had not changed, however. When I returned to the table, the $100 bill was sitting there, but it was now joined by a small folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and saw that it was a brief handwritten note. It simply read, "It would benefit you to accept this." A shiver tore through me. I was almost positive he didn't intend this to be friendly. Although it wasn't necessarily threatening sounding, his attitude change gave me the impression it was a helpful hint. The entire predicament has made me confused and unsure of how to move forward. On one hand, the gentleman has not come out and clearly threatened me in any way. Up until our last interaction, he was nothing but happy and kind towards me. He also has never actually claimed to want to go on a date with me. As a matter of fact, he denied that this was his desire when I confronted him about it. To top it all off, I don't know one waitress who would dare turn down a $100 tip and see it as anything other than a show of thanks for good service. When it comes to the change of personality, for all I am aware, something terrible could have occurred while I had gone getting his drink. It may have zero to do with me. On the other, however, his instance that I accept the large tip clearly makes me uncomfortable. He has to be able to see this. Continuing to insist I accept it should be a bad sign. The split-second change in his attitude after I told him I was not interested was more than likely connected, even if it was not. The speed at which he could become so different and the darkness of his eyes would certainly give anyone pause. As if it even needs to be said, putting the tip and the ominously written note together with the very unsettling interaction we had just had, I am of the almost 100% belief that I was being threatened. Nevertheless, even after writing this, I am completely at my wit's end and have no idea of how to proceed. This gentleman is a longtime customer of the restaurant, and up until a few days ago, I've had nothing but positive, if not slightly difficult, interactions with him. Since my grandparents had passed away before I was born, I've spent very little time with people of his age, and I'm afraid I have mistaken harmless flirting with that of a predator. Therefore, I put this to you. What action do you think I should take next? Am I being an oversensitive snowflake, or do you see trouble in my future? Any feedback will be taken into account and considered. I definitely wouldn't be putting myself out like this if I didn't feel I may be in trouble. I need help, and I need it now. Nearly all men have a story or two of a crazy girlfriend in their history. What I'm about to share is my most recent and scariest encounter. Since I was 19 or so, I've waited tables in almost every kind of eating environment you can think of. My favorite and newest job is at a small Tex-Mex place in the hill country of Texas. I've been here a tad bit over 2 years, and it's proved to be the best paying job I'd ever had. Early on in my tenure, I started hooking up with, whatever terms you choose to use, with another girl working tables here as well. Once it became clear what was going on between us, I was warned by several of the others to turn and run as fast as possible. I normally would have heeded their warnings, but I was already ensnared in her web. Being a somewhat shy guy, anytime a girl appeared to be attracted to me, I fell pretty hard. And believe me, this girl was a looker. Seeing as I was too far gone, I was going to have to find out what made her so dangerous the hard way. The first clue came not long after we began dating. We had been hanging out around my place one evening, and she discovered some photos of an ex-girlfriend. She played it cool and simply mentioned that the photos made her uncomfortable. So, being the fool I am, I volunteered to throw them away. It wasn't until much later that I realized that had been her intent all along. Not that she knew how simple it was to control me. The next example was far more severe. I had the day off and decided to go have some beers with a friend. When she got off that night, she called me to come over to her place. Thinking back, she likely didn't provide me with much choice. When I arrived, I mentioned what I had been up to that day. She finally showed her true self. Instead of voicing her concerns directly, she pulled the silent treatment on me. I caught on something must have been wrong and asked her what it was. I got the usual nothing. Like a sucker, I kept asking until she unloaded on me. Per usual, it all connected to her insecurity. She began asking if I was with another girl. Honestly, I said no, but she wasn't happy with this. What followed was a 4 or more hour argument that only ended because I was too tired to continue. She was now up 2 against my 0, and it only got worse. The beginning of the end was when she accused me of using my aunt's funeral as an excuse to go back home and get laid. I'd had enough after this and dumped her over the phone. Unfortunately, doing this would only escalate her craziness. On my first shift after returning from the funeral, we were supposed to be working together. She had me a little nervous, but when I showed up, I discovered she had called in sick. It was a relief until the shift ended and she sent me a text saying she had nothing to live for anymore. A smarter guy would have seen this for what it was, but I'm not that guy. Rushing over to her place ended up being a ploy to get us back together, and for a short time it worked. However, it didn't last, and the final straw was not long after. I was working a shift, and I received an odd text from her. All it said was, "Someone let your dog out." The second I read it, I went into full panic mode. Either she broke into my place and let him out, or she had someone do it. I showed my boss the text, and he okayed me leaving to check it out. There was a chance this was a trick to get us back together, but I couldn't risk it. When I got to my apartment a few minutes later, my door was wide open, and he was, in fact, running loose. He was easy to catch, but what I found inside freaked me out. She had used a copied key, entered, and ransacked the entire apartment. Clothes had been pulled from the drawers and ripped to shreds. Even worse was that she had smashed every dish and glass I owned and poured salsa and milk all over the carpet of every room. Once I had returned my dog, I drove over to Home Depot and bought a new deadbolt and put it in the door. I took a bunch of pictures, returned to work, and showed my boss what she had done. That was when I made the demand that she be fired or I was leaving. My boss thought for a moment and agreed. Losing her job obviously made her mad. A couple of days later, I came out to go to work and found the word cheater scratched into the side of my car. I have insurance, so thankfully that was no big deal. If that was the price of getting away from her, it was well worth it. It's been almost a month since I last saw her. She sent a few texts, crying about how sorry she is and how badly she wants me back, but I've ignored and deleted them. My life has finally got back to being somewhat peaceful, and I hope not to see her again. I ask you to pray for me and send all of your positive vibes my way that I never do. One last thing, and most importantly of all, if multiple people tell you not to go out with a girl, you should probably listen. They likely have a good reason for it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, juggalos love egg rolls covered in blood.